Hello and welcome to everyone that is joining us right now. Um, Welcome to the session. I'm going to wait another minute or so and then we'll get started. Lily, do you mind giving me a thumbs up when we feel like we've gotten quorum? That would be great because I can see you. For those of you guys just joining us, welcome to the session around adaptive strategies for trustees, part of the Clothworker event series. We're just waiting another few minutes, seconds for people to join us, and then we'll kick off the next hour. Gotten a thumbs up. Thank you all so much for being here. My name is Lena. I'm a principal consultant at MPC. I work across strategy and organizational design and development. Um, Thank you for being here today. We also want to thank Clothworkers Foundation for supporting these events so that we can come together and share some knowledge. Just for your information, please do ask questions through the quick Q&A feature. We'll have moments. We were holding some time at the end for that. Please feel free to change your name screen to show your name and organization. We will be recording the session. And so please note that your questions and comments might be visible, and we'll send a follow-up email after this with the resources, the slides that we shared today, with other resources, and there will be a pop-up that comes at the end of this event to kind of collect your feedback and your thoughts. So we would greatly appreciate it if you had a look at that. That is all the housekeeping for now. I would love to start with this topic of adaptive strategies. Where do they come from? What do they mean? How do they work? Before we dive into some great examples from citizens advice and tender. So let me go. Adaptive strategies, the idea of an adaptive strategy has come from this thought process around leadership development that was developed by Arnold Heidfetz in the US and at Harvard in the late 1990s and early 2000s, where he said the leadership challenge of the 21st century is that we have to balance two things. We have to balance technical problems and adaptive challenges. Technical problems are things that are generally easy to identify. And there's a quick solution, or there is something that we can take from one topic and apply to another. It can be solved top down, it can be solved by structures, and is often expert led. So imagine going to a doctor. It's not always that simple, granted, but if we take it in this purest process, I go there, I have a sore throat, I get a medication, I leave. It might not always be the exact answer, but it works. And it's contained in the space and it requires minimal amount of change. So in short, that means that we have the tools to match the task that we need to do. We might need to adopt the tools a little bit, but we have the expertise that already exists. And we don't require organizations or people to change very much. Whereas adaptive challenges actually are challenges that are unclear. We tend to be almost good at denying them because we can't define them and agree on a definition collectively. There's not really an off-the-shelf solution, and it's not something that you can solve top-down. It actually requires engagement with people who are living the problem and are engaged in the solution, have tried things. It often requires us to challenge the common norms around identity and control and power dynamics. And so the solution becomes emergent, it's developmental over time. And so we might not know what the solution is when we start looking at the problem, but it comes to us. And so as that, we often require organizations and people to change things in ways that they didn't think. And we have these technical problems. They've existed for a long time. The adaptive challenges, on the other hand, show us that there's an interconnected system, and we're seeing more and more of these adaptive challenges. Just to bring in a couple of examples, if we look at the world today around a youth mental health crisis, we have elements around social media, we have elements around compounding crises, we have, school systems, health systems. It's a complex system, and if we want to have a solution, quote unquote, in the youth mental health space, it's going to require quite a lot. And we don't know what that looks like. Same applies for climate justice, the rise of overweight and obesity, but more positively, for example, a great wealth transfer, or overcoming regional productivity gaps. Those are things that we see in the work that the charity sector does. But it's also, these adaptive challenges come up in how we work, how we manage organizational change and transformation, how do we work in hybrid and remote teams, especially after COVID, how do we build culture of collaborations, decision-making and uncertainty. So these are all things where we're challenged to think beyond the kind of, here's a problem, here's a solution, here's how they fit together. And so adaptive strategies came from that. And saying, we're, rather than working in or thinking about strategy as addressing a clearly defined problem, where we have the existing expertise, we're relying on a proven process, we know our 5, 3, 10-year plans, we know our budgets, we know exactly what activities we need to deliver. We're navigating uncertain conditions. We're looking at things from different angles. We're gathering information to inform that process of decision making, but it's not only at the beginning of the strategy process, but throughout. We're becoming more comfortable with uncertainty and looking at reevaluating situations more frequently and seeing how that works. And we're looking at it from a strategic alignment and iterative process. Again, shifting from a fully defined 5-year plan to a 5-year vision and smaller annual plans, so to speak. And for strategy, I've already foreshadowed that a little bit. It's, again, moving from those detailed plans and upfront definitions that are infrequently updated to a more flexible model, where we iterate continuously, update over time. We design for uncertainty and manage that by learning and building in time for learning and reflection. And so that's how we're moving towards adaptive strategies and what we mean by adaptive strategies. Now, recognizing that this is a room of trustees, that also kind of asks you to think about how you can support the adaptive strategies and help your organizations become adaptive leaders. And we're in a, you move from a state of what should we do to a state of what are we not seeing? What are maybe some gaps that we have, and how can we over time address those gaps? So, the old role, or the technical role, is diagnosing the issues and finding what solutions have worked in the past. Is the process well defined? Is the risk management there? Do we have the roles and responsibilities and those kind of things? Into a space of ensuring evidence-based learning and adaptation, creating that space for learning and saying, actually, we might need to pivot a program or another because it's not working the way it is supposed to. Encouraging stress testing theories and solutions and defining assumptions, and then having points at which you want to come back and revisit where you've come to. You have decision making, you always continue to make decisions, but you might be a little more clear. You might be clear on how you make a decision, but you might not be clear on what the decision is that you're making in that moment. And strengthening the transparency and the inclusion and accountability around that. And so on that right-hand side, around thinking about what we're not seeing and how we can address that, that's what in leadership development some might call adaptive leadership. But that is to caveat that we don't want to talk about adaptive strategy or adaptive leadership as being the end state. There is, especially in the leadership realm, it's important to switch between both hats, to switch between knowing when and how to insist on a proven solution and process versus where to leave space for uncertainty. And so, as trustees, moving from one side to the other and back, and helping your organizations and the executive teams do the same is extremely important. So that is a bit of an intro around adaptive strategies, where they've come from, how that relates to the work that you do. And oops, I'm sorry. There we go. And I'm extremely excited today because we have two wonderful guests, Isobel and Trupti. Let me start with Isobel. Isobel Colchester is the Director of Strategy and Impact at Citizen Advice, where she leads the organization's mission-based strategy with a background spanning community engagement strategy, partnerships, and lived experience participation. Isobel brings a breadth of perspective shaped by work across strategy consulting, frontline delivery roles, and and working in an arts foundation. Isobel is particularly interested in how power operates within organizations and the wider system, and understanding how this can enable a more effective, equitable way of working alongside communities. I'm so excited to have you here, Isobel, and for you to share some of your experiences with Citizens Advice. And so without further ado, if I may hand over to you.
Great, thank you. I feel I should caveat it. I'm not drinking a glass of wine. My water glass looks a lot like my wine glass. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. Thank you very much to MPC for inviting me. I'm just going to share my screen so I get that tech bit out of the way. Okay. Great. Okay, so thank you. And thank you, Lena, for that really helpful introduction, which also touches on lots of the points that I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to very briefly introduce the context for Citizens Advice. I'll talk a little bit about our strategy and what we're learning along the way. Some of you will know the work of Citizens Advice already. I work at National Citizens Advice, which is the membership organisation for our wider network, our wider federation of around 230 independent charities. We operate in many different locations across England, Wales and the Channel Islands, and we deliver a huge range of different models. Our organisations are in all different scales and sizes, from small organisations of a couple of £100,000 turnover a year to organisations in the multiple millions of pounds. So a real range of different sizes, funding models, and also delivery models. So some of our advice is delivered online, some of it is in person, some of it's face-to-face. We deliver in community settings, in health settings, as well as in advice vans. So we're in a really wide range of places. And we support on a whole range of different issues, from housing to energy, consumer energy, debt, many more. And people come to us often with one issue, but we will support holistically with the whole problem. And that's very much core to our model. And then through the advice that we give across the country, we use the data that we gather from that advice giving to inform our advocacy and policy work, to build up a really clear picture of the needs that people are facing locally and nationally, and to influence for change. And a bit of a note around the problems that people face. So we see people with around 9 million problems a year, which gives us a really rich data set into what's happening across the country. And those problems vary hugely by location and by place, and require really different sorts of interventions and different approaches. What we're seeing is that the problems that people are coming to us with are getting increasingly more complex. So many more people are coming to us with, on average, around 5 different problems. And more and more people are coming to us in crisis. And that's a trend really that's been going on for the last 6 years, which continues to be compounded by global instability, by the ongoing cost of living crisis. So the environment in communities, as I'm sure everyone is well aware, is increasingly complex and requires a response to that. So our strategy, we moved a number of years ago from having a strategy that said, here are the 6 things that we're going to deliver over the next 5 years. We'll deliver on those programs, and then we'll evaluate them, and we'll develop and iterate and do something new. Into recognizing that the key challenges that were sort of central to our focus had been things that we've been working on for a really long time, and acknowledging that those are things, strategic issues that we were going to need to focus on in a new way into the future. And I'll talk a little bit more about what those are in a minute. But it felt like we needed a different kind of approach that allowed us to be much more adaptable, and to move with the times. Our federated structure also means that collective action is the way that we make change. Our ability to be a really successful community and to be able to work together is really at the core of us being able to be resilient and to work well. But it also means that we have a really diverse range of different ideas about how to address problems in different places, and how do we learn from those and work together. Again, as everyone in this room will be well aware, that the charity sector is in a sustainability crisis. Funding is uncertain, the environment is constantly changing. How we're able to keep the doors open, keep the lights on, meet the needs of the people who use our services, while also thinking about future sustainability and creating the space for imagining something different feels really urgent. So actually kind of tweaking on existing models and staying in the present felt not an option. It felt like we needed something kind of radically new to give us that space for change. And I think I'm going to talk a little bit about this throughout the presentation, but we needed to really think about how do we strengthen the foundations of who we are as an organisation, thinking about the process, the how, as much as the what we're delivering, as a way to build that ability to adapt and to meet the needs of the communities. And I've said here that relationships and culture are everything. And again, I'm going to talk more about that, because those for us are very much the foundations of being able to connect, to collaborate, to adapt. And I put this quote in here from Adrienne Marey Brown, who, if you don't know their work, author of Emergent Strategy, and an amazing activist and movement builder who works across Black feminism and environmental issues, and takes a lot of that into the sort of practice of this book. And this quote, "What we practice at the small scale sets the pattern for the whole system," I really like, because it speaks a lot to how our ability to adapt starts with every single individual within an organisation, every single individual who is affected by the work that an organisation does, and the wider systems around. So how are we thinking it? What's possible at that individual, team, department, organisation, wider partnership level to be able to make that change together? So we have a missions-based strategy, which is our version of an adaptive strategy. And the 3 missions that we focus on are around having advice fit for the future, which is essentially about the sustainability of our advice models. It's about how we use tech and AI to deliver efficiently. It's about our workforce and people and culture. Close the Gap, which is a focus I know of many different charities, ensuring that the needs of marginalised communities are met as effectively as everybody else. And the areas of focus within that are really around how do we increase lived experience participation, how we're partnering more effectively with communities, how we're thinking about taking trauma-informed approaches to addressing intersectional work. And then the final mission is our prevention mission, which again is how do we act earlier, how do we make advice as preventative as possible, partnering with wider organisations and policymakers to make sure that we can become more upstream. And as I said before, these 3 areas are things that have been critical for us for a long time, and our focus going forward is to think about how do we build innovation networks around these 3 areas across our really diverse service to increasingly improve and make progress. So missions are accompanied by an approach, missions-based working, and that's really important, because these 3 missions shouldn't just sit as outcomes that then drive particular activity. It's also about how we're changing the way that we're working to deliver those. So for us, the sort of whole service networked approach to innovation means things like establishing proper peer-to-peer learning and sharing knowledge, like really focusing on the different links, the learning loops and the connections between different parts of the organisation, so that knowledge flows really freely in a way that it doesn't at the moment. thinking about the right kind of leadership models so that leaders of organisations across our network and within the national organisation are able to speak to the challenge, shifting power to frontline and communities. So Lena talked a little bit about this earlier, how we're involving our clients and communities and advisors who are meeting clients every day to inform the work that we do. So again, this type of strategy is dependent on a good idea for the future of the organisation coming from anywhere within our service, and us being able to listen and connect with that and respond. And then shaping internal and external systems. So how we think is much about how we are internally as the way that we're connecting more broadly externally. And this strategy, I should say, is accompanied by a major transformation programme. So over the last 2 years, we've been restructuring and developing the national organisation to be able to work in this way, and that process is ongoing. And I'll just recap on things. I've said some of these things already, but again, why this approach is right for us. Our main focus as a national organisation is making sure that our network is a really effective community that helps us to be resilient and to work and adapt together. We need to reflect the fact that we've got a diverse range of models. There's no one size fits all and no one way forward for any organisation. So we need to be able to flex and change to address that. We're also in a great position because we work with everyone from policymakers to partners to communities. So how are we able to bring those people together to think about what the future holds? What we're learning, really briefly. So I say some of this with, this is what we're learning. These are definitely not all things that we've got right at the beginning, but some things that feel really clear based on where we are now in the journey. So outlining the journey, I think, because where we're headed, we know what the outcomes are, but the way that we get there isn't clear because we need to work together to find new ways of doing that. What that means is I think it's really important to be able to talk about the different stages of strategy. So the one I'll focus on today is where we are now, which is building the conditions for change, and the amount of time that takes, and being really clear about what people can expect to see along the way. Building and maintaining really strong communications and engagement is important because initially, while you're sort of reconfiguring, thinking about the organisation, especially in a large complex organisation like ours, not everybody will be involved in those early stages. So their sense of how does this work impact me day to day? What does it mean? I can't see how it's changing in terms of what I'm delivering, means that we need to kind of connect into the why and when people can expect to be involved. And also spending some time thinking about within the current portfolio of work, what does align with the strategy and actually what feels outside or separate, and actually how can those two things be complementary, and paying close attention to those links so that increasingly the whole is connecting. Building comfort with starting with organisational change. So I mentioned we're very much in the kind of conditions building phase, and that this is the work as much as what we end up delivering. So we're thinking now about, how do we measure the organisational changes that we have made to become an organisation able to respond in this way? How good are we at collaborating? How good are our relationships? How good is our trust? And rewiring those relationships. And that's not just about saying, let's be good at relationships. It's events, engagement, really thinking in a serious way about like the infrastructure that's needed. Again, to one of Lena's points, really thinking clearly about where to decenter decision making. When I joined the organisation, we talked a lot about co-creation. We talked about co-creation applying to absolutely everything, including things that weren't co-creation, kind of because it was an ethos. But actually, it's really important to be clear about when do we apply that power sharing, where is it going to be most effective, and when do we need more operational models. And then thinking about specific areas like adaptive leadership, about performance and impact, and what sorts of conversations are needed in those areas, whether it's about how we're sharing metrics on specific delivery alongside what we're learning, but also how we're making data accessible across different parts of the organisation so that everybody can draw on that to think about what's needed next. And again, just to make the point, for us as a large organisation, that period is ongoing 3 years in. And I'm just going to end really briefly with this slide. So this is from Renacy, who are an amazing kind of place-based consulting organisation. And these are the different stages that they talk about for place-based systems change, which I think really ring true with where we are. So as you can see, this early period is very much about that, building conditions for change and getting the organisation right to be able to adapt. So I'll stop there. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Isobel. That was very insightful and very helpful to bring some of those aspects to life. And then the other person who I have the great pleasure of introducing today to bring a second perspective is Trupti Reddy, who is the Chief Operating Officer at Tender, where she works closely with the CEO and the senior team to translate strategic priorities into effective delivery, overseeing governance, operations, and organizational processes. She joined Tender in 2021 and brings extensive leadership experience from across the charity sector, including as COO of a sport for development organization. Trupti also spent over a decade as a corporate solicitor, bringing strong grounding in governance and risk. And so she brings a broad perspective shaped by experience both in the voluntary and private sectors. And Trupti, we'd love to hear how you're thinking about adaptive strategies at Tender. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Lena. And thanks, Isobel, for that oversight into what's happening at Citizens Advice. It's great to be here with everyone. I'll just share my screen as well. Started. So I will talk about adaptive strategy from a slightly different perspective of a smaller charity. Tender's mission is to prevent domestic abuse and sexual violence through arts-based education. We work with both children and professionals in educational settings to promote healthy relationships and prevent abuse and violence before it starts. We've been going since 2003, so we're pretty well established. It started off as a very small organisation just operating in London, and we are now at the stage where we are active across the country. We've got 4 regional areas, and we reach about 25,000 to 30,000 beneficiaries a year. Even though we've got those local presences in different regions, unlike Citizens Advice, we're just one single organisation rather than a federation. And I'm going to talk about the approach strategy that we've taken since 2023 when we carried out a comprehensive strategy review. So when we started this process with our strategy development, our main goal wasn't to have an adaptive strategy. We didn't start with that in mind. We unfortunately didn't have the lovely NPC guide about it. What we wanted to do was have a clear shared sense of direction that everyone was committed to and could buy into. And even though we didn't have the NPC guide with us, we did end up going through a lot of the processes that they talk about. Part of that was looking at the data and insights that we already had at the start of the process and consulting with a wide range of stakeholders. That included staff and trustees. And we spent quite a bit of time with that because we wanted to make sure that everyone would be on the same page with where we were going. And we looked at data about ourselves, so internally looking at the portfolio of services that we had, our capacity, our capabilities, and we looked at the environment that we were working in, the nature of the need that we were dealing with, what the funding landscape looked like, what the policy landscape looked like. And one of the key things for us, while it can be tempting in those kind of review periods to focus on deficits and what you're not doing or what you might be missing, what set us up really well for the future was actually spending as much time looking at what was working and celebrating that and looking at what we learned from that as well. And that was really important to buy in, which I'll talk about later on. Because we went through such a thorough process and we gave a lot of time to that consulting, without necessarily having planned it to begin with, we did lay the foundations for an adaptive strategy. So key was getting strong buy-in from all stakeholders on questions around vision and mission and on our beneficiaries that we wanted to focus on. So our work is very much about young people, and that remains the case now. That's not something that we foresee changing. But what it also meant, because of that kind of celebration and learning aspect, was that we could also get everyone's buy-in on another key factor being a focus on the impact that we had. So looking at the change that we make with the beneficiaries we work with, rather than necessarily the numbers that we reach or the geographies that we want to work in as the driving factor. So even though we didn't set out with an adaptive strategy in mind, the review process essentially gave us a strategic framework without us initially considering it as such. And key within that was that clarity of purpose of the vision and mission, which Isobel also mentioned, and of our values as well. So these have stayed constant. And even in the most recent fuller strategy review that we went through earlier this year, these haven't changed. So we envisage these being a pretty long-term fixed set of guiding principles for us. Our goals, so the kind of equivalent of the missions that Isobel talked about for us, are defined by the impact that we want to make with beneficiaries, the change that we want to see, and I'll talk about that in a bit more detail shortly. But the other thing that we were able to agree on was that we were in a not fixed environment. You know, there was a lot of change in terms of the external landscape, in terms of the societal attitudes that affect domestic abuse and sexual violence, the growing relevance of the online world in the lives of our beneficiaries. So with all of that in mind and having, you know, got everyone involved in that process, we were able to agree that we needed to maintain flexibility in our service delivery. And I'll talk about how we manage that without losing focus on goals and still maintaining some stability as well at the same time. So as I mentioned, the goals are based on the impact that we want to have as beneficiaries, and we defined as part of that review process 4 areas of difference that we wanted to see from every single piece of work that we did. So this is the change within individuals and within systems that we work with. So it's improving people's knowledge and awareness, their skills, their behaviours, but also looking at the systems that they're in and making sure that the cultures that they're a part of are healthy and supportive for them to achieve or lead healthy relationships, have healthy relationships. And this has been the foundation of our decision making when we do look at what do we adapt on, what do we innovate on versus what do we continue doing as we always have done. No matter what changes in terms of how we work or where we work, these outcomes have remained constant, and we need to show that these will be present in whatever piece of work that we do. And one of the really key things for us in making this a successful process has been investing in monitoring and evaluation and building the capacity to make sure that we had the evidence and making sure that everyone else had the training and the support that they needed to be able to understand this process and understand the information that we based our decisions on. And this has resulted in having pretty consistent monitoring and learning evaluation processes. And that means all of our decisions are much more evidence-based in terms of any changes that we decide to make. Another key enabler for us internally of implementing an adaptive strategy came in how we talked about strategy, particularly internally. When we first kind of wrote up the strategy in 2023 and started implementing it, I think it's fair to say that some staff understood strategy as that fixed set of goals, which Lena mentioned at the beginning, is the other type of thinking with, you know, over multiple years, which just wasn't realistic in a volatile environment where, you know, there's so much change around funding in particular, but also around the environment that we work in. But when we talked about flexibility and adaptability, sometimes for staff, that could sound like strategy was going to become one of those things that sat on a shelf with a nice document, but we were just kind of leaving it behind and we're going to do something else. And neither of those things were true. We were trying to find a balance. We were just trying to find stability and flexibility at the same time. So one way we've found of doing this, which has worked for us, has been to think about what we do in 4 work streams. And I'm going to focus on deliver and innovate here because that's what's relevant to the adaptive strategy side in particular. We were able to kind of show people how we were remaining focused on key ways of working and key services that we already knew worked, that we had evidence worked, and we knew that there was demand for. So that deliver aspect is just ongoing prevention work in schools and specialist settings that we've done for decades, and we know that we'll continue to do because there is a certain amount of stability in terms of demand and our ability to meet that demand. We then created this innovate work stream, which was about giving everyone space to think about actually where do we need to adapt? What could we try that's different to reach the beneficiaries that we want to reach? For example, are there young people who are not in these school settings who we would want to still reach and impact? How would we reach them? Are there geographies that we're not working in that it would make sense for us to look at, etc.? So We made clear that we were going to continue with those core services, but this created a framework for adapting to need, opportunity, and the potential for more impact. We made sure, though, that we had a process around innovation, so that, again, we remained focused on what the impact was that we were making. We created, for example, a project initiation tool so that people could, answer a series of questions to really think about why was it we were going to try something new? What was it that we were going to try? Who needed to be involved? Should we work with partners? All of that, and had clear internal review and sign-off processes and clear steps to pilot, test, evaluate, refine, and then make decisions on whether we continue or stop any of these services. And I've just got on screen here 3 examples of ways of working that we started under the Innovate workstream. So the third one along, Reset Our Whole School approach, is now the most embedded. This we have delivered over a number of years. We know works, we've got the evidence for that, and everyone understands that it's a fully tested proposition, and in fact has now moved within our kind of deliver workstream because it's that well established. The first one, the 5 to 8-year-old program, is at the scale stage. So again, we've gone through a successful pilot and have promising evidence, but we want to see it at a larger scale and see how that goes. So hopefully, again, that will show more success in the next year. And for balance in the middle, I've got one that didn't work, which again, this kind of framework that we have has allowed us to be a lot more honest about and kind of assess things against objective criteria. So this is a tech-based resource for young people. We unfortunately just couldn't see the level of impact that we wanted to see. We couldn't see the feasibility in terms of long-term funding. So because we went through that process, we were really transparent with everyone involved about how we were assessing this. We could also get buy-in for people to understand, sometimes adaptation means we stop some things as well as, starting and hopefully being successful with other things. So we invested in the team as well and invested in the ability of everyone involved to be able to carry out an adaptive strategy. That meant, looking at staff skills and confidence, creating better processes and streamlined ways of working so that this could become more easily embedded. But I'd say the key thing that's made a massive difference in terms of implementation and everyone's kind of understanding of when we innovate, when we adapt, and when we kind of continue business as usual has been the review and planning process, rather than it being kind of fixed annually or every 3 years even. It is a lot more regular. So we have quarterly meetings, for example, which review progress, look at direction. We're kind of keeping those conversations live about what opportunities or risks are there. And that involves finance, delivery, and fundraising teams all working together. So I will say it's quite resource intensive, but we feel it's been worthwhile because of the level of buy-in that we've been able to get. And as I mentioned, the other key aspect is having really clear processes and making sure everyone's aware of them and we're transparent about how decisions are made, and being transparent about the fact that we are ensuring that those decisions are made in evidence. So just finally reflecting on the key things that I'd say we've learned as a senior leadership team working with the Board of Trustees. One of the really important things for us is that trustees and senior leadership speak with one voice, so no one's hearing different messages from different people. So we've worked hard on making sure that we are all on the same page about our vision and mission and values in particular, and how they're central to the decision making. Being clear that, particularly for trustees and also for senior leadership, we're here for the strategic high level goal setting, and that we do then trust our teams to think about where we can innovate and adapt, what might work within the frameworks that we've set. So, we're kind of making sure that they come with ideas that can fulfill certain criteria for trying it. And finally, making sure that we had trustee buy-in from the get-go about the investment needed. So Isobel referred to the, transformation project they're going through on a much smaller scale. I'd say we did the same in terms of just restructuring our little team, recognizing the need to invest in our fundraising team and in our evaluation team, and shifting the focus of our fundraising to more unrestricted funding and increasing our reserves so that we could make all of this possible. So I will stop sharing and hopefully leave you with those thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that great insight. And also, I think what's nice when we look at both of your stories, I think you're still sharing Trupti, by the way, just in case, is, adaptive strategies, they can evolve. They can't, you can come in with the intention, or you can come in and say, there is going to be a change and I want to figure out, it might lead to an adaptive approach to a strategy or how you run things. And so thank you so much for that. I also want to pick up that both of you mentioned the importance of people and staff and taking them along, and both within your organizations, but also outside, and kind of making sure that everybody is aligned and knows what you know and what you don't know and feels comfortable with both sides. I think that's a very, very crucial element. We do have some questions in the chat, so I would, if all right with you, and anybody, please do bring in questions along the way. One I think is a very fundamental one that I want to pick up on is that how do you balance the ability to adapt and to be flexible with on the one extreme mission drift, and on the other extreme kind of having a lack of prioritization? Is that something you guys have worked with? How has that experience been? Maybe Trupti, if you want to start, and Isobel can add on.
Oh, yeah, so that is a tricky one. And that was, I think, one of the challenges that we had when we looked at those, how do we describe things in work streams, was about, how could we be clear with people that even where we were changing, it wasn't mission drift. So we've been really clear, even with those adaptations, of what the parameters are of anything that we do change. And everyone needs to be able to show anything that they suggest clearly links back to the mission. And if it doesn't link back to the mission, then in principle, we wouldn't go ahead. Obviously, with funding pressures, sometimes there are detailed conversations, but that would be our starting point.
Yeah, I guess my build on that, being an organisation like ours, which is quite a large national organisation, and then a kind of diverse network, there are part of the challenge for us is actually there are lots of different sub-strategies already at play. So actually, in the long term, this way of working does help to bring more alignment around that. Yeah. So I think that's just something to note. I think also really agree with what Trupti's just said in terms of the clarity on the outcomes and those goals and those missions, seeing those as a lens for all decision making and prioritization. That is definitely a journey that we're still going on. And I mentioned this sort of point around creating alignment, because there will be amazing, impactful work that you're delivering that has an incredible impact for communities that plays a role for the organisation. It may be really clear how that connects to a particular mission, or it might be further away from that. That's not necessarily drift, but it's more about like trying to hold those two things together, like the sort of current impactful delivery with new emerging opportunity, and sort of thinking about that, being comfortable thinking about those things in two spaces. And it's definitely something we're still growing comfortable with, I would say. So yeah, but also I think I'm like, my other colleagues might say different things to me about this, just me speaking, but I think, we're trying to encourage an environment that is about experimentation, imagination, trying new things. And so this feeling of being able to kind of go off and have a sense, like, I think there's a thing over here, like there's some evidence pointing to the fact that this could be a good idea, and creating kind of permission within the right sort of guardrails, to Trupti's point, for people to be able to look at things like that is really important. So it's sort of like creative, productive, let's not call it drift, but something else that is actually helpful.
Um, Super interesting. I guess my follow-on question from that is if we're saying, you know, the creative drift that allows kind of you people to follow down hunches and evidence as they go along, then the prioritization of that, what are the kind, not necessarily the criteria that you're working on, but how did you have those initial discussions around what the criteria then become, aside from, is it mission, does it lead to an outcome, is that the ultimate, or are there other dimensions that you had to kind of figure out, and how did you figure those out? Isobel, do you want to start? And then
We're happy to go first this time. So our starting point around our missions was to have shared mission leadership groups with national and network colleagues working together to think about what are the shared priorities within each of those areas. That's not to say that is the only work that is important within that mission, but where feels most important to start on a collective space. And some of the priorities that have come out of that area are about pure service improvement. Some of them are genuine innovation, because of where we are. Both of those things are really important. So it's kind of, you need to commit to some things. There will always be other things, and I think our big challenge, and one of the things I think is really exciting about where we will go with this, is building the kind of infrastructure to be able to see what's working in different parts of the system. And we're building a kind of evidence center and a knowledge mobilization process to be able to connect all of that out. So I'm pretty confident that through that process, new opportunities will emerge that we're not currently aware of. So it's about our ability to say, here's what's within the current portfolios, here's something that's happening over here that might strengthen that, or actually should we focus on and bring something else in. So I think that's our process. And I should say also, we started that in a kind of way with leaders, but actually our process now is about how do we distribute that leadership more so that we can work more flexibly around those things, and a broader range of people are involved in priorities.
I'd say for us, there are a number of other criteria, I guess, beyond that, the goal of making that impact. Some of it is around the kind of demand and just making sure that we are able to do the work that we want to do. And a lot of that is about relationships, which Isobel mentioned. So, building out from where we're already present is a part of that. So we'll always kind of prefer work that helps us do that rather than trying to go somewhere completely new, for example. And another aspect that we've been able to tie into kind of fortuitously in the past few years is the wider policy landscape, because actually a lot has changed that is very relevant to our work, and we've been able to tie in with those changes. So, for example, the RSHE curriculum coming in 2020, the new government strategy around violence against women being very focused on prevention. So we've been able to tie in with what's happening more widely as well, so that it's not that we're kind of, jumping on a bandwagon, but those changes are happening for a reason. If there's a real need for those changes to happen. So we want to kind of also make sure that our work is fitting within that bigger picture of a whole societal change that needs to happen.
There's another question in the chat, and I'm gonna, looking at the time, segment this to just Trupti, if you don't mind. How do you work around important topics like safeguarding in your adaptive strategy? How do you incorporate that?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and it's obviously very key with the kind of beneficiaries that we work with. And it is absolutely one of the key questions with the start of any kind of project or anything new in particular that we start, is the safeguarding considerations. And there have been ideas that we've had and particular beneficiary groups that we've considered working with that have actually decided not to, because we don't have the capacity to manage the safeguarding concerns. So I'd say our way of approaching it is to make it one of the first things that we make sure that we can confidently handle.
I would have an M&E question for you, Isobel, if I may. So with the regular adoption and change, review cycles, what does that look like from a monitoring perspective? How do those conversations work? Either from, the citizens' advice as a federation, or at a more local level? Any
I
insight?
would say at the moment, the kind of monitoring from a strategy perspective is about monitoring strategy development process, because that's the phase that we're in. We've got our priorities now, which are set within our business plan for this financial year, but that's the first time there's sort of specific delivery things that are integrated in that way. So those will be kind of monitored in that way. So it's sort of, we have a kind of more traditional like performance reporting approach, but then accompanied by kind of narrative and bringing along the journey of how the strategy development process is going. What I am really keen for us to do more of from now is to have more integration of these are the kind of metrics that we're capturing around how we're delivering, as well as around the kind of organisation that we're becoming, alongside the space for and what are we learning. So I think it sounds like that's very much in place from Trupti's perspective, and that's something that's, it's taken us longer to get to that point. But yeah, I think that's how we will head, and of course that will have an impact on like what kind of performance monitoring frameworks that we have. We're having lots of conversations about what do we measure, what don't we. Yeah.
And I think what's important, it is this process means that you might not have the answers right at the beginning. Again, because you don't know exactly what you're doing, or you have an inkling and then you might pivot. So along those lines, but I would be interested, Trupti, if I may, on that monitoring and evaluation, your innovation project. How does that work, and how does that layer up in those learning conversations?
So again, it tends to be a very early conversation about how we're going to measure outcomes or the impact that we have. How does it align with our pre-existing theory of change, or what might be slightly different? So that's kind of part of the process. And it also means building in quite a bit of time to make sure that everyone's focused on this, making sure we get the information that we need to be able to make those decisions, and then reviewing those on a regular basis. So it's kind of that project planning for innovation is much more intensive than for stuff that's kind of our business as usual, because we build in extra steps for that regular review and pivot if we need to, if things aren't working quite as well as we hoped.
I would have one more kind of question for both of you. What was, as you're moving through this, and granted it isn't you as well as an advisor, but earlier in the process, but how has the reaction been from the funding environment, and what was something that surprised you that you thought was going to be hard and might be slightly more easier to get people engaged with, and what are some of the challenges that you're working with, and how are you thinking about them? Isobel, if you might start, and then Trupti, that would be amazing.
Yeah, I think Trupti might be better placed based on where they are in their journey to answer that one. I think it's really interesting, again, because different kinds of funders are sort of plugged into this agenda in so many different ways. I think, lots of the trusts and foundations are moving in such an interesting direction in terms of more sort of systems-based approaches and systems-based approach to philanthropy, which I think does lend itself really well to that kind of understanding of the needing to focus on process as much as deliverable, as a way of like creating lasting change and resilience in communities. So my hope is that there are openness and opportunities there. I think it's interesting for us because a lot of the work that we deliver nationally is kind of large scale government contracts for sort of service delivery, and lots of those are sort of deeply aligned to the missions that we're delivering, and thinking about how we put those in place. But I would say we're sort of we're developing a new income strategy to align with our missions at the moment. So we're sort of like really in the weeds of that process right now. But what I can say is that we're having some really exciting conversations about this, and actually at a partnership level with funders, I think people are really interested in the organisation that we're becoming internally and what that might mean for how we connect.
Amazing. Trupti, what's your experience like?
I think probably the biggest challenge for us, it has been the short-term funding, and that again is something that we're like hoping is shifting, certainly with newer partners or the ones that we've known for a longer period of time now. there does seem to be more of buy-in for the need for longer term funding, but that's definitely been a challenge, because even with, innovation projects, we're trying something new for the first time. One of the things that we want to know is that we can continue funding it, and it's difficult to do that with current funding environments, unfortunately. So I'd say that's the key thing. And just internally, in terms of our fundraising strategy, shifting to more relationship based and unrestricted funding sources. So yeah, it's been a shift, I think, in mindset from we need to fund certain types of projects to we need to fund a vision and a direction that actually aligned funders will buy into more broadly.
Just to sort of follow up on that, I just would really agree that I think the kind of short-term funding is the biggest barrier to being able to work in this way. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't have this kind of vision, this kind of approach, because it is what is needed. But again, from my perspective, we shouldn't think about these kinds of strategies purely internally. It's about our ability to connect this strategy to wider objectives and build collective strategy. That's why we're doing this, so that institutions become less institutionalized by their walls, and more connected. And then hopefully, I'm hopeful we get to a place where actually we're able to be more long-term together, with those systems partners.
Lovely. I think this also kind of provides a good, from our perspective, that's also always that network and that collective working together is also always a point where trustees can play a bigger role, and kind of in their different hats, how are different elements perceived when you're thinking about designing and wording and how you frame things, but also, taking it out into the wider world, into groups and systems that might not be quite as familiar with the important work that you guys are doing, and getting that going. We are almost at time, so I would like to really thank you, Isobel and Trupti, for being here, for your presentations, for sharing your insights, and also for answering all our many questions. And then there, as mentioned, there will be thank you everyone for being here. Let me start there. Aside from my lovely speakers. And thank you, Clothworkers Foundation, for supporting us on this. We will be, as mentioned, sharing the recording of this as well as the slides after the call. So if you have any questions or anything, then you can have a look or let us know. There will be a pop-up with a quick feedback survey. We would really appreciate it if you could fill that out. In the email, we'll also share some more additional resources. For example, the Adaptive Strategy Guide that was mentioned, if that's helpful. And then we do have a number of additional Clothworker sessions coming up in September around influencing the political landscape, collaboration for trustees as well, and then in October, financial sustainability and mergers of the future. So we're excited to see you again sometime soon, hopefully. And thank you so much for your time. And have a lovely rest of your Wednesday, not Tuesday.
Thanks, Sina. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Take care. Bye.